it's really kind of wild when you think about it, how, I mean, we humans have this long history of trying to picture, like, the divine from those ancient cave paintings all the way to
Yeah.
like the most intense theology debates you can imagine.
Yeah.
But the thing that always kind of gets me is how often those gods, whatever form they take, end up looking suspiciously like, well, us.
Right.
So that's exactly what we're going to be tackling in this deep dive.
Okay.
Why do we see God or gods in our own image?
Interesting question.
You actually sent over some research by humanist pastor James Dolton,
I did, yeah.
whose paper, Understanding Human Perceptions of the Divine, is going to be our guide for this.
Okay, great.
And just heads up to our listeners, get ready, because this goes way beyond just religion. We're going to uncover how our brains are literally wired for this.
Awesome.
So Dolton, he kind of jumps right in, and dives into this really fascinating world of theory of mind.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that, like, we just instinctively try to understand other people, other beings,
Yeah.
by assuming that they have thoughts and feelings, like our own.
Right.
So I'm curious, from your perspective, does this automatically extend to how we imagine God?
You know what? It absolutely does. That very basic drive that we all have to understand what's going on in other people's minds, it just naturally spills over into how we picture God. If we believe that God can feel emotions like anger or love, well, suddenly this incredibly powerful and mysterious being starts to become, I don't know, more relatable.
Yeah.
It's someone whose motivations we can at least begin to grasp.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, now here's where things get, I think, really intriguing.
Okay.
Dolton, he talks about agent detection, which is basically like saying our brains are like these super sensitive alarms that are constantly going off, always scanning for anything that could be a potential threat.
Yeah.
Even if it's something as simple as like a weird shadow or just like a random noise.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Like, is something out to get me?
Exactly. So how does that primal instinct, how does that factor into our ideas about God?
Well, think about it. Our ancestors, I mean, they were constantly on the lookout for danger out in the wild.
Right.
I mean, they had to be as a matter of survival.
Right.
But that also made them, I guess you could say, prone to the seeing intention, like a plan, behind things that might have been totally random. Like a sudden bolt of lightning. That wasn't just weather. No, that was the anger of a god.
Oh, wow.
Right? And it's all about, I think, finding explanations, trying to make sense of the world, especially a world that often felt really unpredictable and scary.
So it's like imposing a sense of control, of order on something that's inherently chaotic.
Exactly.
That makes total sense. So it's about making connections, right?
Yeah.
Finding patterns in the seemingly random events of life. And as Dalton points out, our brains are really good at that, maybe even too good sometimes.
Right. We are wired for pattern recognition, big time. But, sometimes it can go a little haywire, that system. Think about it. We see faces in clouds, or we find divine messages in just random coincidences.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely done that.
Right. It's part of what helps us make sense of the world, for sure, but it also shapes how we picture, like God acting, intervening in our lives.
It's like we're creating this whole narrative, this story, based on these sometimes very tenuous connections that our brains are making.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like our brains are constantly spinning these yarns. We can't help it.
That's so interesting. Now, Dolton, he uses this word anthropomorphism to describe this tendency to give human traits to things that obviously aren't human.
Right.
And it's almost like it makes this whole idea of God a little less overwhelming, less abstract and unknowable.
It does. Instead of trying to wrap our heads around this like vast, infinite being, we sort of subconsciously create one that's more, manageable.
Yeah.
Is more familiar. So yeah, anthropomorphism, it's like a mental shortcut. It makes God more approachable.
Right.
Makes God someone we can actually relate to.
That makes a lot of sense. But, Dolton doesn't just stop at the brain, the mechanics of how we think.
Right.
He points out that we also have like these deep emotional needs.
Oh, yeah.
That this tendency towards anthropomorphism, it actually fulfills those needs.
Big time.
So what do you think he's getting at there?
Well, let's face it, life is full of uncertainty, hardship, loss, and sometimes even just straight up terror.
Yeah.
And so a God who loves us, who listens to our prayers, who even feels our pain, well, that's an incredibly powerful source of comfort, especially when times get really rough.
Right.
It satisfies that deep human need for security, for that sense that something is looking out for us.
So are we essentially like creating a cosmic parent figure?
In a way, yeah, I think so. And with that comes the sense of order in the universe,
Yeah.
that feeling that someone is in control, that things aren't just happening randomly and chaotically.
Right.
And that can be incredibly reassuring for people.
I can see that. What I find really fascinating is that, this isn't just some like Western concept.
No, not at all.
Dolton, he provides examples from cultures all across the globe.
All over the place, yeah.
So, like, what are some of those examples that really stood out to you?
Oh, well, you've got the Abrahamic God, right, who's often portrayed as a loving father figure.
Right.
And that idea of a personal God who cares for his creation, well, that's absolutely central to those faiths.
Yeah.
But then you look at, Hindu deities like Krishna, for instance,
Okay.
who is often depicted as walking among humans, interacting with them in very human ways.
Hmm.
And then, of course, you have indigenous cultures all over the world who have, personified nature with all sorts of spirits and gods and goddesses.
Hmm.
So, yeah, this pattern, this way of thinking, it pops up everywhere you look. It shows just how deeply ingrained this tendency is, in our species, I think.
So it really is a universal impulse to see the divine or the forces that shape our lives in human terms.
It really seems that way, doesn't it?
Now, Dolton, he doesn't stop at just like cultural observations.
No, he does.
He brings in some pretty heavy-duty psychology theories to try to explain all this.
He does, yeah.
And one that he mentions is the cognitive theory of religion, which I got to admit sounds a little intimidating.
I know, right?
Can you break that down for us? What's the basic gist of that theory?
Sure. I mean, it's not as scary as it sounds. Basically, it suggests that belief in supernatural beings, whether it's gods or spirits or whatever, it's sort of a natural byproduct of how our brains evolved to work. So we're kind of primed for this type of thinking,
Wow.
even if it leads us to believe in things that, may not actually exist in the way we imagine them.
That's really interesting. And then there's the emotional regulation theory,
Yeah.
which almost makes it sound like, believing in God is just a way of managing our feelings.
That is kind of the core idea. Think about it. If we can attribute all of life's, the uncertainties, the challenges, the heartaches, if we can attribute that to some higher power, some grand plan, well, it can really help regulate those really difficult feelings.
Okay.
Things like anxiety, fear, helplessness. It gives us a framework for dealing with that tough stuff.
So in a way, it's like, for many people, belief is a healthy coping mechanism.
It can be, for sure. Of course, like any coping mechanism, it can be taken to extremes, and become unhealthy.
Right.
But the basic idea, I think, is that believing in God, particularly a God who appears, human-like, it can be a real source of strength and resilience, especially when people are facing really difficult times in their lives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This is all really insightful. But Dolton, he doesn't shy away from some of the potential downsides of anthropomorphism.
He doesn't, no.
So, what are some of the criticisms that he highlights in the paper?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that, by squeezing the divine into a human mold, we might be, drastically oversimplifying it. And, this could really limit our understanding of what God or the divine truly is.
Yeah.
And it can even lead to some pretty, I guess you could say, theological inconsistencies.
So are we trying to cram infinity into a little finite box that our brains can understand?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, if we insist on viewing God through a strictly human lens, we risk missing out on, the vastness, the mystery, the transcendence that lies beyond our limited human comprehension.
That's a good point.
It's like trying to describe, the taste of a strawberry to someone who's never experienced flavor.
Wow, that's a great analogy. And could that, that oversimplification, could that lead to more rigid beliefs, maybe even beliefs that could be harmful?
Sadly, yes. I mean, if we start to believe that God is simply a bigger, more powerful version of us, with all our flaws and limitations, then we also risk projecting our own prejudices, our biases, even our worst impulses onto the divine. And history, unfortunately, offers a lot of really tragic examples of that.
Yeah. That is a pretty sobering thought. It makes me think of all the times in history where religion has been used to justify violence, oppression, even genocide.
Exactly. It's a dark chapter in human history for sure, but it's so important to acknowledge those darker sides. It really underscores the potential dangers of anthropomorphism when it's taken to extremes.
Right.
Because if we believe that God is sanctioning our actions, no matter how cruel or destructive those actions might be, well, we can kind of relinquish our own moral compass, our own sense of responsibility.
So we're essentially handing over our power, our agency, to an external authority that we've basically created in our own image.
That's a really insightful way to put it.
Wow.
And it speaks to another, I think, really important critique of anthropomorphism, which is that it can foster a sense of dependency, even helplessness.
I see what you mean. If we believe that everything is ultimately up to God, then what's the point of even trying to make a difference in the world?
Exactly.
Where does human initiative fit in if God is calling all the shots?
Right. I mean, if we view God as this all-powerful puppet master controlling every little detail of our lives, it can really diminish our own sense of responsibility
Right.
and our capacity to create change, to actually do something in the world.
So it can lead to a sense of apathy or just kind of giving up, well, it's all in God's hands anyway.
It can, yeah. Creates that passive outlook, well, it's all part of God's plan, so why bother?
So in a sense, this over-reliance on an anthropomorphic God can actually be quite disempowering.
It can be, absolutely.
Now, Dolton, he seems to be suggesting, at least towards the end of the paper, that it might be time for humanity to kind of move beyond these simplistic, human-centric ideas about God.
He does, yeah.
But is that even possible, given how deeply ingrained this tendency seems to be in us?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a huge challenge, for sure. But I do think there are ways to cultivate a more, I guess you could say, nuanced and expansive understanding of the divine.
Okay.
Even if we can never fully grasp it, with our little finite human minds.
So what are some of those ways? How do we start to do that?
Well, I think for starters, we can try to nurture a sense of humility.
Okay.
Really recognize the limitations of our own human perspective. It's about acknowledging that our concepts, our language might be, totally inadequate when we're trying to describe something as vast and mysterious as God.
Oh, it's about being okay with not knowing, with embracing the mystery.
Exactly. It's about, recognizing that there's always more to learn and discover. We can't, force the divine to fit into these neat little boxes that our minds create.
Right, right. It's like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
I love that. I think that's such a healthy attitude to have, especially when we're dealing with these big questions about, spirituality and the divine.
Yeah.
It keeps us open to new possibilities, new ways of understanding, instead of clinging to these rigid interpretations.
Now, Dolton also talks about the importance of exploring different spiritual traditions and philosophical perspectives.
Yeah, he does.
Is that part of this expansion of understanding?
Absolutely. By, really exposing ourselves to different ways of thinking about God, we can challenge our own assumptions. And we can really broaden our horizons. It's about seeing the divine through multiple lenses, and recognizing that no single tradition or perspective has all the answers.
So it's like we're building up this, spiritual vocabulary,
I like that.
so we can have a richer, more nuanced understanding.
Exactly. It's about enriching our understanding by drawing from, this whole tapestry of ideas and experiences from all these different traditions.
That makes me think about, the mystical traditions that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
They seem to be very comfortable with ambiguity and with paradox, embracing the idea that God can't be fully defined or contained by these human concepts.
Yeah, they do. And, they often emphasize direct experience, intuition over dogma and really rigid belief systems. It's about cultivating a more, I guess you could say, fluid and open-ended relationship with the divine, allowing for mystery and wonder.
So it's less about arriving at a fixed destination and more about the journey, the exploration.
Exactly. And that journey, that can be a lifelong exploration, full of unexpected turns and really profound insights along the way.
This is also thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It really is we're peeling back the layers of an onion,
Yeah.
and just revealing more and more complexity with each layer.
And that onion, it's been growing for millennia, absorbing all these influences from countless cultures and traditions.
I have a feeling there's a but coming.
Well, even as we acknowledge the limitations of anthropomorphism and we try to strive for, this more expansive understanding of God, I think it's important not to dismiss that very human need for connection and relatability, that really drives this whole tendency in the first place.
So like we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. I mean, there's a reason why throughout history people have found solace, meaning, comfort in these gods who resemble them.
Yeah.
It's a deep human impulse that I think we should honor and not just, totally disregard.
So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory ideas then?
Hmm.
How do we embrace the mystery of the divine while also honoring our very human need to, connect, to understand, to relate?
That's the real challenge, isn't it? And there's no like easy or straightforward answer to that. But I do think it starts with, recognizing the inherent tension there, holding those opposing ideas in our minds simultaneously. It's about acknowledging the limitations of our human perspective while also appreciating the power of our imaginations,
Mhm.
to create meaning and purpose in the world.
So it's about embracing the paradox, the both hand,
Yeah.
rather than getting stuck in the either.
Yes. I love that. I think that's really it, recognizing that we're both, these finite beings with all our human limitations, but we're also capable of, glimpsing something much greater than ourselves.
That's such a beautiful and humbling thought.
It is.
And it makes me wonder, how all this plays out in our everyday lives, how we relate to the world, to other people, even to ourselves.
That's a great point. And it's actually a perfect segue into another, I think, really fascinating facet of anthropomorphism that we haven't really touched on yet,
Okay, I'm all ears.
which is how it shapes our relationships with other people and even with ourselves.
Oh, intriguing. Tell me more.
Okay, well, just think about how often, in our daily lives, we project our own expectations, our desires, even our fears onto other people.
You mean like uh, assuming that someone is mad at us when they're just, having a bad day?
Right.
We've all been there.
Exactly. We weave these elaborate narratives about others based on our own internal world,
Right.
instead of truly seeing them as, complex individuals with their own thoughts and feelings and experiences that are totally separate from our own.
Hmm.
It's like we're imposing our own interpretation of reality onto their reality.
And that would be considered a form of anthropomorphism, wouldn't it? I mean, in a sense, we're attributing these human-like qualities to others, but those qualities might be more about us than them.
Absolutely. It's like we're projecting our own image onto others, just as we do with God. It's so fascinating how that pattern repeats itself.
That is a fascinating parallel. So this tendency to anthropomorphize, it's not just about, our relationship with the divine.
Yeah.
It's about how we perceive and relate to everyone and everything around us. It's like a lens that we view the world through.
I think you've nailed it. It's a really fundamental part of being human, this interplay between projection and perception,
Yeah.
between seeing the world as it is and seeing the world through the filter of our own subjectivity.
I love that. This has been a truly mind-blowing deep dive. We've journeyed from like cave paintings to the cosmos to the very heart of human relationships, all in one conversation.
This has been quite a ride.
It really has. And it's amazing how it all connects.
It is, isn't it? And I think it really underscores how understanding this human tendency to project, to anthropomorphize, it can offer us such deep insights into our own nature, and our place in this vast, mysterious universe.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to pause here for now, let our listeners kind of absorb all this incredible information. But we'll be back soon with even more insights and thought-provoking questions to consider. So until then, stay curious, everyone.
Yes, stay curious.
All right, so welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. We've been on this incredible journey so far, exploring this idea of anthropomorphism. How we humans just can't seem to resist projecting human qualities onto everything, from gods and goddesses to the vast cosmos, even to other people. It's been a real mind bender.
It has.
And we've talked about how this very human tendency can be both a source of comfort and connection, but also a potential pathway to some pretty limited, maybe even harmful viewpoints.
Yeah, it really is this fascinating paradox, right? It's just
Right.
baked into how we see the world.
It really does feel like a two-sided coin, when it comes to human perception. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned, I think it was back in part 1, about this idea of how we project our own image, not just outward onto others, but also inward onto ourselves.
Yes, that's where things get really interesting, I think, from a more psychological perspective.
Okay, now you're really taking us down the rabbit hole here. But I'm game if you are. Walk me through this.
All right, so think about it this way. Just as we might envision, God as this loving, compassionate figure, we might also kind of unconsciously internalize that image, and then we start to strive to embody those ideals in our own lives. It becomes a model for how we think we should be.
So you're saying our concept of God can actually influence, like, our own moral compass, our own development even.
Yeah, for a lot of people, absolutely. Those beliefs, those images that we hold in our minds, even subconsciously, they can act as like these internal guides shaping our values, our aspirations, even our sense of, who we are in the world.
This makes me think about, like, people who struggle with, really intense self-criticism or negative self-talk. Could it be that those harsh inner voices are also a form of projection? Maybe reflecting how they perceive God as, like, judgmental or punishing.
That's a really interesting connection, and it's definitely possible. If we believe in a God who's like quick to anger or punishment, we might internalize that and basically become our own harshest critic, always fearing judgment, always trying to avoid making mistakes, like at all costs.
Right. It's like setting ourselves up for failure. Yeah.
Exactly. It sets up this like impossible standard.
So it's almost like we've created this internal God figure that's constantly watching our every move, scrutinizing everything we do, even when we're alone with our own thoughts. Talk about pressure.
Right. And that kind of internal pressure can be so damaging, to our
Yeah.
self-esteem, to our ability to like live authentically. It can really fuel that shame, that guilt, and even lead to those self-sabotaging behaviors, where
Mm.
we're almost trying to make those fears come true.
Oh man, this is getting kind of heavy.
Mhm.
But it's so insightful at the same time. So is there a way to kind of turn this around? Can
Yeah.
we use this, this understanding of projection to cultivate a more compassionate, supportive relationship with ourselves? Because it sounds like we could all use a little more of that, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Absolutely. I think there's tremendous potential for that. And it really all starts with, becoming aware of those projections,
Yeah.
recognizing those internal voices and seeing them as echoes of beliefs and experiences that might not be serving us anymore. It's like, yeah, it's like realizing that we've been wearing glasses with the wrong prescription. It's time for an upgrade.
So it's about actively challenging those old narratives and rewriting them with a more loving and accepting perspective, like basically giving ourselves a break.
Exactly. Just as we can choose to evolve our understanding of God or the divine, we also have the power to, evolve our understanding of ourselves, cultivate that self-compassion, recognize our inherent worthiness, regardless of, our flaws or mistakes. We're all works in progress, right?
I love that. That is such an empowering message. It's almost like we can become our own benevolent gods,
Yeah.
offering ourselves the same kind of love and acceptance that we might, seek from some external higher power.
I love that. It's about recognizing that divine spark, that wellspring of love and compassion, it might be within us all along. We just have to like tap into it.
Man, this has been such a mind-bending deep dive. I mean, we've explored so many facets of this idea of anthropomorphism, from the ancient roots of religious beliefs all the way to the intricate workings of like our own minds. It's wild how it all connects.
It really is a testament, I think, to the interconnectedness of well, everything. And I think it really highlights how, understanding this human tendency to project, it can offer us such profound insights into our own nature and our place in the universe, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's like the one thing you would want them to remember about this whole idea of anthropomorphism?
I think it's this. Anthropomorphism is this powerful force that shapes how we see the world, the divine, and even ourselves. It can be a source of comfort, of connection, of meaning. But it can also limit our understanding and even lead to beliefs that can cause harm. The key is to become aware of those projections, to question our assumptions, and to cultivate a more nuanced and compassionate perspective on everything, including ourselves.
That's beautifully said. It's about, taking all of this and using it to become more conscious creators of our own reality, both internally and, out there in the world. Well, folks, that about wraps it up for this deep dive. But if you're eager to explore further, we've got a whole bunch of resources waiting for you over in the show notes. So be sure to check those out. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep expanding your understanding of this amazing, mysterious world that we all share.